back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our examination of this period 1920 to 45. And in this last preliminary lecture, we're going to be talking about the historiography of this era. That is, some of the historians who have studied and written about it, and some of their big ideas. Now, I should underscore that this is not intended to be an exhaustive and completely thorough look at the historiography of this era. We could spend all semester doing that. Instead, I just want to hit some of the most prominent scholars, some of their major ideas, along with some of the overarching themes in the historiography, and the ways that our interpretations of this period in general have changed over time. Let's start by talking about some of the most prominent overall schools of thought about this period 1920 to 45. And actually these are things that you might have heard about or thought about without even realizing that they were classified into these different schools. Perhaps the most prominent is known as the traditional school or traditional history of this era. In this view, the period is broken down into several obvious chunks, almost irresistible chunks. The great capitalist expansion and prosperity of the 20s, the roaring 20s. The worst depression in American history. And I think it only adds to things that the period is broken down almost exactly at the end of 1929 and the beginning of 1930. The dramatic political and social reform of the 1930s, followed by the cataclysmic world conflict that follows. And again, that break coming very neatly, almost irresistibly, at the end of the 30s and the beginning of the 1940s. And finally, the rise of the United States as a great world power. So one contributor to this traditional history was Arthur Schlesinger, who wrote one of the masterworks of this period, The Age of Roosevelt, published in 1957. In Schlesinger's interpretation, American history is cyclical. Periods of public reform occur every 20 or 30 years, followed by periods of retrenchment and conservatism. So we have the Progressive Era, then the retrenchment of the 1920s, then liberalism of the 1930s, and eventually a retrenchment of conservatism again after World War II. In Schlesinger's view, it is political phenomena that are the defining events. And of course, he portrays the period as a series of sharp breaks. The Depression, for instance, is a sharp break from the 1920s. Other historians coming a little later counter Schlesinger. Most notably were historians of the school known as the New Left, historians of the 1960s, driven by the chaos of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and Vietnam. They challenged traditional interpretations. They insisted on the examination and exploration of the history of minorities, women, and the common man. They begin to look at the interwar period from the perspective of the common man, who's growing lost in an increasingly bureaucratic, less personal, government-driven society. For folks like those, things might seem more the same throughout this period than the sharp breaks that Schlesinger and others refer to. How different were things for a farmer, for instance, in 1916, 1918, 1922, or 1935? In many ways, things remained largely the same. So the sharp breaks that seem so obvious to us, looking back on that era, might not have been obvious at all to people from certain social groups and classes. One example of this way of thinking is Barry Karl, who published The Uneasy State in 1983. In Karl's view, the United States has moved away from unity, not towards it. There's been a move towards bureaucracy, limiting outsiders, encouraging and insisting upon assimilation. In his view, we must study race, ethnicity, gender, and many different groups. And in doing so, we realize that the United States is not a melting pot so much as a blend of many different histories. There are also historians who come to challenge the Roaring Twenties idea. some of them coming to view the 1920s as a time of middle-class conformity and bigotry. Historians like William Leuchtenburg, who published The Perils of Prosperity in 1958, he examined fundamentalism, prohibition, the Klan, and immigration restrictions, and recognized the 1920s not as a period of frivolity and great fun for everyone, but instead a period of conflict. Many other historians have expanded upon his initial arguments. Leuchtenburg, for instance, described such conflict as a rural-urban conflict, a new secular urban culture versus an old religious rural culture. While true in some ways, most scholars now would argue this is a simplification. Recent historians have studied urban problems and rural problems and realized that all groups were affected by things like the Klan and fundamentalism. These struggles deeply permeated American society. Just as scholars have re-examined and in some cases overturned original thinking about the Roaring Twenties, others have turned to the 1930s and reinterpreted that era. Discontent in the 30s was pervasive, not just a local phenomenon. The protest movements of the 1930s, led by Huey Long, Charles Coughlin, and others, long believed to be radicals at the fringes of society, were not just extremists at that time, but rather signaled a deep-seated content that ran through much of American society. There are also scholars who have revised traditional views of political history. Arthur Schlesinger, again, for instance, in his writing, described the 1920s as an era of political retreat. Weak presidents, reactionary, stagnant. There was an interlude between the active presidencies of the Progressive era and the New Deal. But later historians, such as Arthur Link, argue that elements of the progressive movement survived into the 1920s, and that Harding and Coolidge were much more active than previously thought. Historians such as Hawley argue that this era, the 1920s, sought economic order and scientific management by cooperation between labor, capital, and the state, which sounds an awful lot like the progressive era. Hawley also contributes to a rehabilitation of the reputation of Herbert Hoover, who traditionally has been branded as a terrible president. In his work, Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce, published in 1974, Hawley emphasizes Hoover's work before becoming president and describes him as a victim of his times. Even the Hoover presidency, he argues, had unprecedented federal activism and laid the groundwork for the New Deal. There have also been scholars who have re-examined the career and impact of FDR, who in Schlesinger's traditional interpretation is the singular figure of the age. And while that idea hasn't changed radically, there have been scholars who have re-examined his role. In 1963, for instance, William Leuchtenburg published Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, opening a new line of argument. While Leuchtenburg remained sympathetic to FDR, he describes the New Deal as sort of a halfway revolution, emphasizes that it didn't end the Great Depression, that it incorporated the Roosevelt recession, and there were severe limits to the welfare state. Other historians have taken that view even further and emphasized the limitations and failures of the New Deal rather than its successes. Most modern historians take a stance similar to that of Leuchtenburg, delivering plenty of praise upon FDR for his many successes, but also pointing out some of the shortcomings and weaknesses of the New Deal and even some of FDR's failings. In other cases, historians simply take a different approach to the era. Elis Hawley, in The New Deal and the Problem of Monopoly, published in 1966, developed a new way of thinking about this period that he called the broker state. By the time of the Second New Deal, even those in the federal government, including FDR and the New Dealers, realized that the problems of the Great Depression were too great even for the federal government to fix directly. And so the government became essentially a broker between workers and consumers, employers, employees, and big business. efforts to guarantee the rights of workers and farmers and allow the system to work itself out. And Hawley argues that this is the essence of the Second New Deal, not a failure by FDR by any means, but a different way of interpreting his intentions and outcomes. And finally, many scholars have begun to re-examine this era in light of its impact on minorities, such as African Americans and women. Most of those earlier historians really focused on political events and the actions and achievements of white men. And so we have works like John Blom's V was for Victory, published in 1976, Harvard Sitkoff, A New Deal for Blacks, published in 1978, focusing on the gains of blacks during the war, and the enormous migration of blacks to the northern urban centers. There are many, many others, and we'll talk about some of those as we get into those discussions specifically later in the course. Others, such as Sarah Evans, who published Born for Liberty, A History of Women in America in 1989, discussed the impact of the war on women's rights and the fact that women experienced new roles during the war. At the same time, men expected traditional roles, which sets us up for a conversation of the 1950s and the return to more traditional gender roles in the aftermath of the war. So these are some of the themes and big ideas that we're going to be covering throughout the course. As we return for our next lectures, we'll begin diving into the 1920s in earnest, beginning looking at the outcomes of World War I and the long shadow that it cast on the era of the 1920s.